Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss how the NFU and even MI5 are warning about food security, but how not just Brexit, but Tory ideology in general will be leaving us walk into that cliff edge of food scarcity, not because the government don't know how to deal with it, but because they don't think they should deal with it at all. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So back, feeling a lot better, thank you very much. Let's try and get through this in one take. So, as with a few other sectors, farming has gone through the usual cycles of Brexit now. You know, the first cycle was experts going, right, Brexit's going to do this, and it'll inevitably lead to these impacts. So, for example, for food supplies, the hypothetical issues would be, say, supplies of chemicals, possibly machinery, agricultural workers, definitely, viable export markets, absolutely, as well as the loss of EU subsidies. All of these would put pressure on the industry to shrink. Then the next cycle, we saw what happened in the first year. As other countries were recovering in 2021 from COVID, we were still lagging behind in general, but where farming was concerned, we knew that crops were being left to rot in the fields because there weren't enough workers to harvest them. Healthy pigs were being culled because there weren't enough butchers. For the first time ever, we had to import turkeys last Christmas. First time ever. It's one of those things we supply ourselves. No, we couldn't last year. So we had to get them from Poland, some other places in the EU, because domestic production was too low. Now we're in the third phase, where we haven't just, the experts have said what was going to happen. Then we've seen that the experts were right. But now we've got the cold, hard figures to go along with it as well. The 2021 data is in and analysed and all the rest of it, and it's starting to be reported on. And government figures show that food production in 2021 was lower than 2020. So it's not just about going, oh, well, this farm's had to leave a load of food rotting, and this farm's had to leave food rotting, and this farm's had to just cut back what it even plants. Individual stories. No, we've got the overall picture. And I do have to point out, and I have to point this out a lot, you have to remember, 2020 wasn't a normal year. 2020 was the year when a lot of production around the world and in this country was reduced or even stopped altogether for a time in certain sectors because of COVID. The only industry that I suppose might justify a worse performance in 2021 than 2020 might be PPE production. For farming, it made no sense at all. Farming had its own problems in 2020. We hadn't left the single market yet, and we didn't have specifically the Brexit problems then. But there was a mimicked effect in that travel restrictions due to COVID meant a lot of British farms struggled for seasonal workers. I said at the time, this is going to be a trial run for when it's not COVID bringing temporary movement restrictions, but Brexit bringing permanent ones. And so we saw production in the first year of Brexit proper was worse than the year of COVID. And the government did nothing about it. They are restricting access to seasonal migrant workers deliberately. That limits the amount of crops that can be grown and harvested. The government's solution is more automation. Well, fine. But it's not exactly being rolled out, is it? The government are doing nothing to drive it. So what's actually happening is that fewer crops are being planted and some farms are just going out of business. It's all very well talking about robots as if you pick up a few for a £5 from Amazon for the next day delivery. The National Farmers Union has said that Britain is sleepwalking into a food supply crisis. Now, they want the government to do more to help recruit seasonal workers and get better deals when dealing with supermarkets. Obviously, the latter is something they've urged various governments to do for quite a long time, well before Brexit. And yes, the NFU is obviously lobbying on behalf of farmers. Yeah, they are biased, yes. But we do know that they're not just ringing alarm bells to get a better deal for their members here. We've seen for ourselves that since Brexit, our food supply chains have become vulnerable because there's been times when they've broken. We've had shortages at various times, sometimes quite severe shortages, this year and last. And it's not been replicated in neighbouring countries. Food supplies in Europe were, of course, hit this year when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Europe. Well, it was Europe, but Ukraine specifically, and bombed the crap out a load of their farms. Ukraine is a major exporter of food. This obviously is going to create an international problem. But it was still Britain whose supply chains cracked the most. And that's not a joke about the egg shortages, by the way. The problem is that Brexit causes issues of its own, but it also makes other problems worse. You know, Russia's action against Ukraine wouldn't have been, it would have been a hit to food supplies whether we were in or outside of the EU. But because we left, we made it worse. The continental-wide single market prioritises supplies to itself. This is without the EU hierarchy explicitly doing so. They can do. If they need to, they can do that. But the system naturally does it because it's easier and cheaper to supply a business inside your market than it is outside it. For example, a sheep-infested island on the outside of the single market. You know, when supply chains are under pressure, it's the parts which are already under pressure from other things, like needless trade barriers, that break first. You know, we are less profitable to supply than other parts of Europe, unless, of course, we accept much higher prices. So in times of restricted supplies, we suffer first. You know, and it isn't just like we can just keep hiking up the prices we're willing to pay to get these supplies, you know, because that has been happening. But people can't afford it. They can only afford a certain amount. I saw a report the other day that highlighted part of this problem. It showed that the average UK citizen was as wealthy as the average German citizen before the Brexit vote. Now we're 15% poorer on average. So we've gone from being on par with a German citizen to our buying power is now lower, but our prices are higher. To overcome those needless trade barriers, our prices are now higher. So our food production's going down, making us more reliant upon imports, but those imports are going up much higher in price. We want to secure those supplies where there's already squeezed supply chains around Europe. We have to pay much more to remain a competitive consumer. You know, and if this decade is supposed to be teaching us anything, it's that it's not ideal to be reliant upon imports of essentials, and it is absolutely suboptimal to place pressure on your own supply chains unnecessarily. And food, of course, is fairly essential, but the government's doing nothing about it. They could. You know, their Brexit traps them into limited action on some of the areas, absolutely, but they can easily deal with some other issues that are not directly linked to Brexit. But they won't. And put it this way, food supplies in the UK are an entirely private sector matter. You know, it's generally worked in the past because we've had enough food provided, supermarkets are genuinely competitive, farmers have sometimes got a raw deal out of the system at times, but the subsidies presumably helped. And from the government's point of view, if we are being supplied with a wide variety of produce and there's no issues, then they don't see a problem. You know, other than those in the bottom decile not being able to afford it, but that was down to poor incomes rather than high food prices, and the Tories didn't care about that either because the food banks dealt with it. But they're not changing their mind when the facts change, because this is a matter of ideology. It's Tory doctrine that the government shouldn't manage people's lives. They call it the nanny state. You know, I've pointed this out before to explain their policies in other areas. The reason they are running down public services, for example, is because they want them replaced with privatised versions. Some think that privatised versions are more efficient. Some just don't care. But they all want infrastructure to be provided by private companies, not the state. They see state intervention as a sign of failure. This explains their general state of self-loathing now. They hate that the only thing they've done in 12 years that was popular was the vaccine rollout and furlough scheme. New leader of the SNP in Westminster yesterday asked Rishi Sunak in PMQs, what's the Tories' greatest achievement? And Sunak said, furlough and the vaccine rollout. Oh, they hate that. Massive state intervention is what they're proudest of, he says. And it's making them sick. But it's not making any of them rethink their ideology. You know, when they listened to their leader say that the things they're most proud of was massive state intervention, it didn't get any of them to think, are we getting this a bit wrong? You know, if Tories who are trying to break up what infrastructure the state already provides, they're not going to intervene in a sector which has always been privatised, are they? It's like when Brexit introduced us to the concept that our facilities for lorries were woefully inadequate. Boris Johnson's response was not to plan to build up the infrastructure. He said that the industry should provide it. If you need more service stops, well, the industry should provide them. But there's no commercial reason for them to do so. That's when you need the state to provide what is good for society, but not a good opportunity for profit. But no, the Tories don't put so much effort into winning power because they want to govern. They do it because they want to stop others governing. They're professional seat fillers. If food supplies are vulnerable, and we can clearly see they are, the Tories will just sit back and do nothing at all until it's too late. Not because they're not aware of the problem, not because they think it's fine. They're not like the dog in the room on fire going, this is fine. They know it's not fine. They just don't think they're the ones who are supposed to deal with it. They're sat there looking around waiting for someone to deal with it. And everyone else is looking to them. And they're just looking around going, well, who's going to deal with this? This is ridiculous. Why are our food supply struggling? Who on earth should be dealing with this? This is why a Tory government is harmful at any time, but at a time of national emergency, downright dangerous. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.